So we're going to just focus a bit on the Christmas story. Anyone know, if you bring the next slide up, anyone know what that number's significant, why that number's significant? What's that, Tim?
I think the number of days till Christmas.
It is. Not to alarm you if you haven't started doing any Christmas planning, but that is the number of days to Christmas. It freaked me out when I looked it up. But what I wanted to do is spend really the next couple of sessions that we've got together to think about the Christmas story, because Christmas can be a bit of an escape from reality for people. Already I'm seeing the tints all going up, the lights all going up and stuff like that around our flat. And it is a time when people do want to do that, don't they? They do just want to kind of overindulge on food and drink. They want to blow the budget a bit, and they want to kind of break from perhaps some of the troubles and the realities of the world around them. And of course, for some people, Christmas isn't going to be like that. Even Christmas won't be that opportunity to forget about their difficulties. But actually, there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to celebrate Christmas. And certainly it's a time where it's of amazing wonder and joy. It is the greatest news. It's not just a break from reality, it's the greatest news of all time. But we need to remind ourselves that actually the way Christmas is presented, perhaps, is not the reality of what the first Christmas was like. When the angel came and announced to the shepherd, they did say this will be great news and great joy for all people. But actually, when you look at the first Christmas story, it doesn't happen like that. It happens, it is a miracle, but it happens in the middle of a right mess. And the Christmas story isn't this escape from reality. The whole thing takes place in the midst of the sort of realities that we see in the world today. So we see that it's in the midst of a dictator that's ruling, who is a cruel tyrant and a brutal dictator. And it happens in a nation that is under occupation by the Roman Empire, a brutal conqueror. And it happened, and they've been a nation that have been under occupation for hundreds of years by different other nations. And it's also a place where the powerful oppress the weak all the time. And it's also a place where the parents who are rescuing this newborn baby from violent persecution end up living their first few months or the first few years out as refugees in another country. So we can relate to that in the world around us today. And the school nativity plays that we see, I remember them when my kids were younger, they just don't really do any of that justice. But I was reminded, I don't know if anyone's seen the film Nativity, have people seen that film? But there's a wonderful bit in the film of Nativity where there's two teachers basically that are competing to put on the best nativity play. And one of them wants to put on this dramatic production. So he thinks, how can I do a different slant on it? So he comes up with the idea, he says, well, nobody's really ever done Herod. So I'm going to do a production of the nativity with these cute little kids of the Herod bit of the story, which is the slaughter of the innocents. So I thought we'd just play that clip, if you just bring it up.
So happy, Mary, little Christ.
Who are you and where do you come from?
We are the three kings, and we've come to find the baby Jesus. He's the new king of the Jews.
Kill every boy and child in this land.
And I'm not it is worth saying that actually the times of the first Christmas were times of extreme brutality. The world of Jesus, where he was born, was a world that was dangerous 2,000 years ago. And it was full of brokenness, just like our own. And the first Christmas is also full of stories of really ordinary people in the midst of that, who've got challenges that are made known to us. So it's got the story of a young couple who basically come out of a nowhere place in Israel. And they're not wealthy and they're not privileged. And there is a young mother in that who's become pregnant and she's not married. And that's incredibly risky and incredibly dangerous for her. And a husband-to-be that is trying to make sense of this complete mystery that is going on in his life. And there's a childless couple that are just hanging out and have been hanging out all of their life to have a child and are in extreme old age. And there's two elderly people that have just been waiting all of their lives for the hope or the good news that God is going to come and do something in their nation. And they've just been waiting all of their lives for that to come about. And there are outsiders in the story. So we see the wise men, these men from a foreign land that have come into the story. And we see the shepherds that are people of really low status in their community. They're outsiders, even in their own community. And they're all involved in this story. And whilst most of us have heard all that and know all of that, but we've got to remember as well, at the time this would have been happening, it wasn't barely registering on the Roman Empire, in the Roman Empire. These events were happening. When they were happening, they just weren't known about. And that's why Luke, one of the writers of the New Testament, he is a follower of Jesus, and he wants to make sure that these events are captured and recorded so that they're passed on and they're made known and they're kept and retained by the early church. And he writes that, and the person of Jesus, by the time he's writing, starts to expand. The knowledge of him and the awareness of him is starting to expand. But at the same time, as it expands, people are starting to get persecuted because they're a follower of Jesus. And so he wants to make sure their confidence and their faith is rock solid in what they're putting their faith in. And as I say, it sort of helps to go through this, because I want to just, as we go through it, think, well, all of the tinsel and all of the way in the manger and the lowing cattle and all of that stuff, it's a bit more raw and it's a bit more messy than that, what's going on. And what I want to do is encourage think that Christmas isn't really about just escaping from reality, but it's much, much more about these events are the centre of reality. And Jesus' birth is called the incarnation, which means becoming flesh. It's the eternal reality of God coming to live among us. The centre of history. His life, Jesus, his life and death and resurrection, and it's the foundation of a new order, a new way of living, a new relationship with God. And whilst there are miraculous things that happen in it, people say, well, but if God exists and he really did come down in human form, we'd expect it to be pretty miraculous. But actually also, we'd expect God to be free man, to really understand our experience. We'd also expect him to come into a world of suffering, because we've all had experiences of that. So if you just go back a slide, if you could just go back one slide in, so I think I've got the slides out of order. So if you just go back one. Does anyone recognise what these films have in common? Anyone recognise any, this one's the latest one out on the left. What have they got all in common?
They all came out at Christmas on cinema.
They all came out at Christmas in the cinema? I don't know, they might have done, I'm not sure actually, yeah.
It's got made the first one.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. They're all prequels. And what's a prequel? A prequel is just telling us a backstory to the main event. And today, that's what I want to look at, is I want to look at a prequel event. So what I want to look at is Luke, when he starts his account, he's actually looking not at the story of the birth of Jesus. Before that, he's looking at the story of the birth of a man called John the Baptist, who was a cousin, a sort of relative of Jesus. And John the Baptist is a really important person in the New Testament and in proclaiming about who Jesus is. He occurs in all of the accounts of Jesus' life, but only in this one do we hear about his birth. And Jesus gives him special attention and says, this guy is particularly significant because he's preparing the way for me. And that's what John does. John the Baptist is a good example for all of us that actually we're signposts, living signposts to point to Jesus for people. Nobody really keeps really good news to themselves. And John the Baptist's parents, when he's born, are incredibly old. And he's set apart from the womb and filled with God's Spirit. And I guess that's a really helpful reminder that God can use both the very old and the very young. And as I think about our little people back there, I think, actually, let's not underestimate how God can use those people. And let's not underestimate us if we're on the other side of the thing, that actually God has still got a purpose and a plan for our lives. So I'm just going to read it. I'm going to start, if you just flip through in slides, that's it, yeah. So I'm just going to read it, and then I'm going to just comment on it as we go through it. So I'm just going to take us through it. So it says this is the start of Luke, and it says this: many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They've used the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I have also decided to write an accurate account for you, most honourable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught. When Herod was king of Judea, there was a Jewish priest named Zechariah, and he was a member of the priestly order of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also from the priestly line of Aaron. Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous in God's eyes, careful to obey all of the Lord's commandments and regulations. They had no children because Elizabeth was unable to conceive, and they were both very old. And so, like I said, this is something of a bit of a prequel. This isn't Jesus' birth. This is a relative of theirs, a lady called Elizabeth, and her husband Zechariah. And Luke wants to remind the people that are reading this guy Theophilus, he wants to remind him that what he wants to do is tell you this stuff so you can be certain of the things you've been told. And one of the things he does is he's quite good. If you read through Luke, you'll notice he's pretty good at trying to pull out information that can help you situate this at a particular point in history. So he talks about the King Herod here, and he talks about the place where these events are all going to happen. Okay? And he wants to do that because he wants us to be sure and certain of when these events occurred. Okay? And he gives us some information about this couple as well. And he says about them that they've got character, they're really faithful to God, these people. But he also gives us a bit of window into their heartache, and he says they're childless. And this week I've had to tell quite a lot of people about the passing of my mum last week. And some of those conversations have been really brief, and they've just been like a sentence with some people. But what I've noticed is when you say a sentence like that, it just doesn't do it justice. And I think when I read verse 7 here, I get something of that. The sentence doesn't do it justice. They had no children because Elizabeth was unable to conceive, and they were both very old. And a few months ago, I had a colleague who was just sharing about their attempts to have a child and how they'd been trying for some years to. And they were just sharing about how every time they had a pregnancy test and the result came back negative, the heartache of that. And they were sharing about how every time they heard about someone else who was pregnant, how they wanted to celebrate with them, but at the same time in their own heart, they were kind of, their heart was just battling that grief. So there's all of that emotion, all of that fear, all of that longing. And that's repeated month after month after year after year. And culturally back then, it would have been very shameful it would have been viewed as a shameful thing not to have allowed to bear children. And it would have also been a fearful thing as well, because like many nations today, there would have been no NHS, no social services. So your family was your lifeline, your safety net. And I guess we might not have experienced that particular type of loss or grief in our lives, but we might know other stuff. It might be a loss of a relative, it might be disappointments of unfulfilled hopes and dreams that we've had as life moves on and, things pass away. But there's a lot in that sentence about the broken world that we live in. And then Luke goes on, so if we go on to the next slide, he says this: one day Zechariah was serving God in the temple, for his order was on duty that week. And as was the custom of the priests, he was chosen by lot to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and burn incense. While the incense was being burned, a great crowd stood outside praying. So just a bit of background. So Zechariah was part of what was called the priestly order. Basically, it meant his heritage, his background was he was descended from a group of Israelites that their duties were as priests. And they were up for this duty at the temple, to serve at the temple in Jerusalem. It was kind of a bit like you were a religious school prefect. You were, that chosen for this. And there were a lot of these priests, so it was one of them things you only really ever got to get called up for once in a lifetime, like a jury service type thing. It was also something that was a great privilege to do. So when he gets called up to do this, he would be telling friends and family up to Jerusalem, I'm going to spend the week and I'm going to be doing this great and privileged task. And here he is, this man who's, like I say, it's this once in a lifetime opportunity, and he's here performing this sacred duty, and he's a godly man, and he's going into the holiest place. The place would have known is the place where God would be encountered more than anywhere else in all of Jerusalem. He was there praying with the people, and they would undoubtedly have been praying for their nation to be restored, the oppression that they were currently experiencing from the Romans. And they would also have been praying for all of the Old Testament promises of God that they would come about for their people. But despite all of this, despite him being this man of faith, this man who's set apart as this mediator between God and people, and he's in the holiest place in Jerusalem, what happens next is completely outside of his frame of reference, completely beyond his understanding. So if you move on. Thank you. While Zechariah was in the sanctuary, an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing to the right of the incense altar. Zechariah was shaken and overwhelmed with fear when he saw him. But the angel said, "Don't be afraid, Zechariah. God has heard your prayer. Your wife Elizabeth will give you a son, and you are to name him John. You will have great joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. For he will be great in the eyes of the Lord. He must never touch wine or any other alcoholic drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before his birth. And he will turn many Israelites to the Lord their God. And he will be a man with the spirit and the power of Elijah. He will prepare the people for the coming of the Lord, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children. And he will cause those who are rebellious to accept the wisdom of the godly." And I don't know what his expectations were that day, but an angel appearing in his midst was definitely not one of them. And even though he was in the most spiritually important place, at the most spiritually important time of his life, he was completely unprepared for this, and it's a terrifying experience. I mean, it would be. And Zechariah would have known about appearances of angels from the Old Testament. But what you've got to understand is there's been a 400-year silence between the Old and these events, the Old Testament and these events. The time when God last spoke to his people. And what the quote from the bottom of that section there is from a book called Malachi, which is in the Old Testament. It's a 400 years before written promise about what's going to happen. And like I said, it would have been prayers and prayers that this Zechariah as a priest would have said in his hometown and would have he would have talked about, but it would have been generations before him as well, that this event is going to come to pass. But what's amazing about this encounter is that the angel brings the message that God has heard his prayer. And when you look at that, you think, well, actually, at this point, I don't know how much Zechariah would have been praying about having a child. That would have been his prayer from years and years ago. And I don't know if anyone here in the room has been praying for anyone or anything for a long time. I know I have. I've got family that I've been praying for about 25 years, or since I've been a Christian. And I expect there are people in this room that have probably been praying for longer for some things and some people. And I imagine that Zechariah and Elizabeth, when they're praying and have been praying for a child, have been praying for a long, long time. And I don't know whether Zechariah was that day praying for a child. I think from what we read, it's very doubtful. But somewhere along the way, God has answered his prayer and heard his prayer, and he's going to do something in it, even though he's not aware of that. And I take great encouragement in that, because my levels of faith for unanswered prayer go up and down all the time. But these verses say that God hears. And this answer to prayer is good news for him personally, but it's also for him in the world. It's an impact on the world. It's personal because it's about them having a child, their long hope. But it's bigger than that because it's prayers about God doing a new thing and breaking in. The prophecies of a Messiah who is going to be a saviour that is going to come, and Zechariah's prayers are talking about him delivering this promise now, after 400 years of waiting. So how does Zechariah, this righteous man, how does he respond to the angel? Well, if we read the next bit of the story, Zechariah said to the angel, "How can I be sure this will happen? I'm an old man now, and my wife is also well along in years." Then the angel said, "I am Gabriel, and I stand in the very presence of God. It was he who sent me to bring you this good news. But now, since you didn't believe what I said, you'll be silent and unable to speak until the child is born, for my words will certainly be fulfilled at the proper time." So look, Zechariah's faith is at an all-time low. Whatever prayers he prayed previously are lacking now faith that God would fulfill them. He's not some spiritual superman. He's just a guy who's faithfully trying to live out his life before God, trusting him, and completely unaware that God has already answered and heard his prayers from years before. And I suppose what you notice here is that what Zechariah has in mind is his present. So he looks down at his old body, his withered body, and he says, well, and he never tells his wife, but he also said she's a bit old as well. But he looks down at his withered body and he says, well, look, how is this going to produce a child? But the angel, Gabriel, where is their vision? They say, I stand in the presence of God. And I think it's really interesting that you get that very different perspective of when you look at your Creator God and you see that actually all things are possible. And how does the angel help Zacharias refocus, to rely on God, to look to God? Well, what he does is quite interesting. So when my kids were younger, one of the things we do is we have a thing called thinking time, which was basically the naughty step or time out, but it was renamed in a very positive parenting kind of way, because that sort of thing Felicity would do, wouldn't it? Yeah. So it was called thinking time, but I actually think it was a really good idea. It's a much more helpful way of thinking about it. And it actually, so it was a time when you took a child out and you said, you're going into thinking time, and it was a time where you would think about how you've reacted or how you would responded. And I think that's what happens here. The angel says, look, I'm going to give you some thinking time. So he makes him stop talking, stop speaking, and he basically says, you're going to do this for 9 months. And it seems like quite harsh, but something changes, as we'll come on to see, in Zechariah's thinking and his perspective in that 9 months of not being able to speak, in that actually he's forced to listen and he's forced to be in the presence of God without spouting off, but with just hearing and receiving what God has got for him. So it goes on to say, meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah to come out of the sanctuary, wondering why it was taking so long. And when he finally did come out, he couldn't speak to them. Then they realised from his gestures and his silence that he must have seen a vision in the sanctuary. And when I read about that, I've noticed something. Why do we play charades at Christmas? Does it come from this story, these gestures, and this silence? I don't know what the correct gesture for vision is, but somehow he communicates to these people that something incredible has happened, and Zechariah must have come from a very low point of faith, and now he's riding on a wave of hope and promise. And then if you carry on, it says, when Zechariah's week of service in the temple was over, he returned home. Soon afterwards, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and went into seclusion for 5 months. How kind the Lord is, she exclaimed. He has taken away my disgrace of having no children. So his priestly service comes to the end, he's gone home, and he has to try and explain to her without words what's happened. And I love Elizabeth's response of gratitude. And again, I don't think a single sentence captures it. She lived with shame for years and years and years, grieving and hoping, and perhaps till all hope's gone. And perhaps she'd kept a spark of faith alive with stories from the Old Testament there were many stories in the Old Testament of women who were infertile, but God did something incredible in their lives, and maybe that was kept a spark of faith alive. And I just remember from the Case for Faith evening the other night, and we were just talking about the place of thankfulness, and the place of thankfulness in the midst of suffering. And I've been thinking about that a lot as I've mourned my mum this week. How helpful it is to just be thanking God for her life. And thankfulness isn't a habit I'm brilliant at, as my family will tell you, but it's one that I think changes us from looking at a perspective ourselves and looking at God, the great giver. To know the kindness of God. How quickly Zechariah picks up on what's this change in his person. As I say, he's got 9 months of silence, but Elizabeth, she seems to get there before him. I think that's often the case, isn't it? Women seem to get there first or whatever. But yeah, he's definitely slower. But the rebuke of the angel gives him that thinking time. And Elizabeth gets there, and she herself is, as soon as she encounters the pregnant Mary with Jesus, and she knows that Mary's child is special, and she says immediately, this is the Lord. This is the Lord in your womb. Zechariah takes that time, that 9 months to get there. But finally, when John the Baptist, as he becomes known, John is born, his voice returns. And these are the words that he utters. And he's filled with the Holy Spirit. And this is the prophecy, this is the song that he says that declares all these promises of God that are about to come true. So if you just bring it on. It says, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he's come to the people and he's redeemed them. He's raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he has said to his holy prophets of long ago. Salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show mercy to our ancestors and to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all of our days. And now speaking about his son John, he says this, and now you, my child, will will be called a prophet of the Most High. You will go before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the Son will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, our feet into the path of peace. Zechariah declares this great fulfillment that Jesus is the promised Messiah, the one who all that the fulfillment of promises, that's his saviour from darkness and death and sin and order of the world. And he says, Zechariah, he prophesied over his own son and says, you will be the one who prepares the way for him. And so I just want to finish with two very brief takeaways from it. With this really, just to say, I think this story talks a lot about prayer and unanswered prayer. And it also means that unanswered prayer doesn't mean unheard prayer. And it reminds us that actually just because we haven't seen an answer doesn't mean God's rejected it. And I've family members, and ever since I've been a Christian, and God may have granted an answer to those prayers and yet see the results. But I also now I know that God has heard them and he's not indifferent to my prayers. And it's an encouragement to just keep going and asking for more faith in the things of God. It's a reminder that the miraculous just can break into the very ordinary. And that's what we see time and time again in the Christmas story. It is that ordinary people with God doing extraordinary things. And God isn't slow in keeping his promises. And what he has promised is that in the light of eternity, every promise that he has made will be fulfilled in Jesus. And I think in Zechariah's silence, we see something of God's kindness in discipline as well. Because for Zechariah, this was a changing experience. And I think for times of silence and times when we don't see prayers answered and the waiting times in our lives can be times when actually God can speak to us more clearly. And I think there's the other thing about this story is there is God weaving this bigger story through very ordinary people. They're not superheroes. And as I say, Luke wants to ground it in reality. He wants to ground it in, you can be certain of this stuff through the lives of these ordinary people where this extraordinary event has come along. And he recognises and acknowledges the personal suffering of Zechariah and Elizabeth. Their long waiting, their silence, and it reflects the bigger picture of God's 400 years of silence, that he's been waiting to this moment to bring about this first Christmas. But even in those times, God is working, God has heard, God cares, and he breaks that silence at just the right time with the coming of Jesus, his son. And the nativity story is full of miraculous, it's full of miracles and angels and wonder, because it is about the Creator becoming one of us. But it's also about him entering into a world full of suffering. And it's really important to understand the backdrop of that. And the beginning to the letter of Hebrews says this: in the past, God has spoken to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. See, God hears us, and he continually speaking to us through the sending of his Son, that we might know the love that he has for his creation. And I say, are we listening? Are we seeking him? And it's a great time, this time of Christmas, to build up, to say, are we making space and are we making silence to actually hear what God is saying? And we spoke about this in the Sermon on the Mount series, right at the end, where Jesus said, what are you building your life on? What are you going to build your life on? And what I would say is that don't build it on surface realities, because a lot can change in a week. A lot can change in 2 weeks or whatever. We live in a broken world, and things can be going along on us, but something can come and just take us out. Don't be building our lives on surface realities, but build on the ultimate reality, which is the Creator God, the everlasting God that has become human and lived amongst us and died and came back to life. And I just would encourage us over this Christmas period, take time to reread the stories that are so familiar and refresh it, but ask God to be speaking to you through them. And so I'm just going to finish and pray for us now as we finish. And I'm just aware that there are, we've got people that go through some stuff that's, time passes very quickly and things difficult, within the last 12, 18 months, whatever. But also there are people amongst us all that are things over that same period. But what my prayer is that in it, that the promises of God are the things asked, that the person of Jesus is the thing we cling to. That's what we've been singing about in all the songs we sang today and all the words that came out. I just want to pray that for us. Jesus, help us to centre our lives on you. You are the centre of reality. And I pray for us now. I pray as we go from here, whatever our individual reality or whatever those are, God, don't let that be our resting place. Don't let our vision just sit on that, but let us cast our eyes on the Creator God, on the God that became flesh, that lived amongst us, who was born, who died on a cross and came back to life, and now lives forever. And all of our hopes and all of our true hope is in you, Jesus. Help to keep our eyes on that. God, I pray as we go about everyday realities in your precious name. Amen.